Like the video, subscribe, and comment your country below so I know who's listening tonight. Turn off the lights and put on headphones for the full horror experience. Let's begin the nightmare. If you're brave enough. The desert was older than memory, and when the wind moved across the cracked mesas, it did not sing, it hissed, carrying with it the scent of dried blood, coyote musk, and something much older, something born of hunger and loneliness, something that stalked without footsteps and devoured without remorse. And though most who lived near the reservation boundaries knew better than to wander into the canyons at night, tourists came anyway, drawn by cheap legends and drunken bravado, leaving only bones and shredded clothing in the sand for the vultures to collect like little offerings. But for the rangers of Red Hollow National Park, this desert was not an urban legend. It was a daily curse, a graveyard with an ugly sense of humor. And no ranger knew this better than Ethan Cole, a 34-year-old veteran ranger with haunted eyes and a shotgun always strapped to his back. A man whose voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had seen too much and slept too little, because Ethan remembered the night 6 years ago when he and another young ranger followed a set of footprints into a ravine. Footprints shaped like a man's but spaced wrong, angled wrong, dragging like someone walked with broken legs, and he remembered hearing screaming long before he found the source. A girl, maybe 18, shredded from the ribs down, her intestines pulled into a spiral shape on the dirt like some kind of obscene symbol, and she kept trying to talk, but her jaw was torn loose and hanging. And when she died, her eyes went wide, staring at something behind Ethan, and when he turned, he saw nothing but desert, nothing but the shifting shadows cast by a full moon. Yet the air smelled wet and spoiled, like an animal's breath, and that smell followed him home for months until his wife left, saying she could not sleep next to a man who woke screaming in a language he did not know, a language made of guttural clicks and broken syllables. Now, 6 years later, Ethan worked mostly alone, patrolling night shifts because the younger rangers quit after a month, saying the darkness felt alive, like it watched them, judged them, waited for them, and though Ethan knew fear, he also felt duty, because someone had to search for the ones who wandered too close to the things that hunted beyond the tree-line. Someone had to collect whatever pieces were left behind, and so when the radio crackled that first October night, Ranger Cole, we've got a missing person report from Blacktail Trail. Last seen 2100 hours. Ethan sighed, grabbed his rifle, and wondered if this one would be recoverable in one piece or whether he'd be filling another plastic bag. Because no matter how many warnings the park posted, no matter how many disappearances hit the news, dumb kids still came for ghost stories and TikTok videos, chasing the idea of danger until they found the kind that bites back. And as Ethan drove his Jeep toward the trailhead, the desert night swallowed all sound, leaving only the hum of the engine and the scraping of dust across metal. But what unsettled him most wasn't the darkness. It was the absence of wind, because Red Hollow never stayed quiet unless something was hunting, something intelligent enough to wait, something that wanted its prey to scream loudly, maybe to wake others, maybe to attract more. And when Ethan reached the trailhead, he found an abandoned tent, still warm, scattered beer cans, and a small camcorder blinking red, still recording, and Ethan didn't want to pick it up, didn't want to see what was captured, because cameras always documented death long before anyone could stop it, but he forced himself, rewinding until the last frame showed 4 college students laughing, drinking, telling stories about skinwalkers, mocking the elders' warnings, and the camera guy, a kid with a shaved head and a cocky smile, pointed the lens toward the darkness and yelled, "Yo demon bitch, come out and eat me," and the others laughed, but seconds later something answered, not with hoofbeats or growls, but with a perfect imitation of a human laugh, except it was broken, stuttering, glitching like a corrupted recording, and the kids went quiet. Then the camera dropped sideways, capturing only half a face, a girl crying, whispering, "It knows our names," and then she screamed loud enough that Ethan flinched watching it, because the scream didn't stop, even when the girl was ripped from view, dragged backward into the night by something too fast to see, and the camera shook violently, showing flashes, blood, claws, bone, something tall and thin with arms too long, legs bending the wrong way, skin hanging loose from the joints as if it had been stitched together from different bodies, and just as the lens caught a glimpse of a face, Human eyes, familiar, terrified. The screen went black, leaving only the sound of someone speaking in a deep, unnatural voice, speaking English but wrong, like someone learning speech for the first time. "I know you, Ethan," and as the recording ended, Ethan froze because no one had said his name, not once, not in the footage, and the realization slithered around his spine like cold venom. This thing, whatever it was, remembered him, had learned his scent, his fear, his name from that night 6 years ago, and now it was mocking him, calling him out, taunting him, and Ethan whispered, "No, not again." But before he could move, a distant scream split the darkness in two, coming from the ravine, long, wet, and full of despair, and though every nerve in his body screamed to turn back, to call backup, to let the desert claim its victim, Ethan sprinted toward the sound, rifle raised, boots pounding loose sand, and he told himself this time would be different. This time he would save someone. But as he neared the ravine, the air turned foul, thick, saturated with the smell of rot and copper, and the rocks ahead glowed with a faint, unnatural shimmer, like moonlight bending around a shape invisible to the eye, and Ethan stopped just short of the ridge, peering down, and what he saw turned his stomach inside out. 3 bodies, skinned, flayed, arranged in a circle, limbs bent backward, and something crouched over them. Something that looked vaguely human but horribly wrong, hunched, skeletal, neck too long, shoulders dislocated, and it turned its head toward him, slowly, as if savoring the moment. And in a voice identical to the girl from the footage, it whispered, "Help me," except the mouth didn't move, and Ethan realized with dawning horror that it wasn't speaking. It was playing her voice, mimicking, taunting, hunting, and as it rose, towering, twisting its bone frame into a new shape, something less animal and more human, Ethan felt the desert wind finally return, howling through the chasm like a death cry, because wind always followed the Skinwalker, a herald of death. And Ethan finally understood. This thing didn't hunt for food, it hunted for identity, for faces, for voices, for the thrill of wearing new flesh, and the night had only just begun. Ethan didn't know whether to fire or run, because his training told him bullets were useless against something that didn't follow the rules of biology, and yet his instinct, the stubborn human arrogance that believed metal and flame could solve anything, made him take aim at the creature's malformed chest, and before it finished rising, he squeezed the trigger, the shotgun roaring a thunderous blast that echoed across the canyon walls, sending dust and loose stones tumbling, and for a split second the creature lurched backward, not in pain, but in surprise, as if offended that a meal would dare resist. Then it twisted its torso in an unnatural spiral, bones cracking like branches in a fire, and leaned forward again with a grotesque smile spreading across a face that changed shape with every second, transforming from the crying girl into the cocky boy, into a ranger that Ethan once worked with, into a face Ethan didn't recognize. And as the creature's neck elongated and vertebrae popped, Ethan realized this wasn't just mimicry. This was possession, inheritance, assimilation, and the legends he had once dismissed as metaphors suddenly came alive. A Skinwalker did not merely shapeshift, it became its prey, and every voice it stole, every face it consumed, became a living echo trapped beneath its skin. And as Ethan chambered another round, the creature stepped onto 2 legs, wobbling like a newborn deer, trying on its new skeleton, testing the limits, until it snapped its shoulders into alignment with such force that Ethan winced. Then it took a step toward him, slow, deliberate, dragging its left foot as if savoring the moment, because predators that control their environment do not rush, and the canyon behind Ethan felt impossibly vast, a labyrinth of limestone and shadow where countless bones lay rotting beneath the sand, and he wondered how many screams this desert had swallowed, how many people had died alone while something ancient watched them bleed out. And when the creature finally spoke again, the voice wasn't the girl's or the boy's, it was Ethan's, a perfect replica, every cadence, every breath, every tiny hesitation, and hearing himself say, "You came back too late," sent a chill deeper than any scream could, because it meant the creature remembered everything. The night 6 years ago, the girl he couldn't save, the ranger he left behind, the guilt that hollowed him out, the drinking, the divorce, the nightmares, and as Ethan fired again, a blast that tore chunks of flesh from the creature's shoulder, It didn't flinch, didn't stagger, didn't react like an animal. It simply looked down and rearranged its stolen tissue, knitting new muscle over exposed bone with a wet, slithering sound, and Ethan realized the shotgun wouldn't kill it, but it might slow it, might inconvenience it, which was enough for him to scramble up the rocky path toward the ridge. Because somewhere beyond this darkness, somewhere past the skeletal trees and dead brush, he had a jeep, a radio, maybe help, though deep down he knew help never came fast enough, not out here, not in a place where screams dissolved before they reached the sky, and as he climbed, gravel sliding under his boots, he heard movement behind him, quiet at first, like the gentle padding of a dog trotting through leaves, then faster, louder, claws scraping rock, and when Ethan turned, the creature was bounding up the ridge on all fours, its limbs bending too wide, too loose, as if dislocated, but still strangely efficient, and Ethan shoved shells into his gun with shaking fingers, turning to fire point blank. But the creature didn't charge, it stopped, crouching low, head tilted like a curious child, as though mocking the ritual of reloading, the frail human act of preparing for battle, and then it began to speak again. But this time the voice wasn't familiar. It was dozens of voices layered over one another, overlapping, echoing, men, women, children, laughing, weeping, and beneath it all, a low growl that felt impossibly old, a voice that didn't belong to humanity, but existed before language, before fire, before fear had a word, and it hissed a phrase Ethan didn't understand, something not meant for human ears, a curse or a command, and the air around him grew instantly heavy, thick, suffocating, filled with a metallic taste of blood, and Ethan stumbled backward, nearly slipping into the ravine, because the world felt warped, bent, as if gravity itself recoiled from the creature, and in that moment Ethan flashed back to the elders he ignored as a rookie, the ones who spoke in hushed tones of spirits that were the dead, of curses born from greed, betrayal, cannibalism, rituals older than the desert itself, and Ethan cursed himself for not listening, for thinking monsters were only metaphors for trauma and history, and just when he thought the creature would lunge, rip open his chest, consume him scream by scream, a distant howl split the night, not coyotes, not wolves, something deeper, more thunderous, a call so raw and ancient that the creature froze mid-motion, lifting its head toward the sound, sniffing the wind with sharp, jerking motions, and Ethan recognized the expression not as fear, but annoyance, like something territorial had disrupted its meal, and without warning, the creature pivoted and darted back down into the canyon, disappearing in a blur of bone and skin, leaving only a sticky trail of blood and tissue on the rocks, and Ethan didn't waste a second, sprinting toward his jeep, heart pounding like a jackhammer, tasting adrenaline and dust on his tongue, because whatever had howled in the distance, whatever had interrupted the hunt, wasn't a savior, it was a second predator, a second force, and Red Hollow had become a battleground, not just between man and monster, but between monsters themselves and Ethan. Realized with growing dread that the disappearances, the mutilations, the grotesque arrangements of bodies, those weren't random acts of violence or hunger, they were warnings, territorial markers, messages, perhaps even ritualistic responses to something more powerful encroaching on sacred ground. And when Ethan reached the jeep, hands trembling so violently he struggled to fit the key into the ignition, the radio crackled to life without him touching it, a static whispered voice calling his name, not human, not electronic, a hybrid of the two, saying, "You can't run from what remembers you," and Ethan floored the accelerator, kicking up a storm of dust as he barreled down the dirt road, headlights cutting weak beams through the ink-black night, but the desert around him seemed to close in, and though the jeep hit 40, 50, 60 miles per hour on open terrain, the shadows moved faster, keeping pace along the dunes, flickering between trees, silhouettes galloping with inhuman speed, and the deeper Ethan pushed into the desert, the more he realized the Skinwalker wasn't chasing him. Not yet. It was herding him, guiding him, steering him towards something, and a primal nausea twisted through his gut because predators don't guide prey unless there is something worse waiting at the destination, and Ethan's mind spiraled into fragmented memories. The girl's torn face, the ranger who vanished without a scream, the smell of wet fur on his porch after nightmares, footprints, around his house that no animal could have made, and the words of the old Navajo ranger who quit the job after his second week, handing Ethan his badge with shaking hands. This land remembers what was done to it, and it punishes those who pretend they're safe. And as Ethan sped deeper into the killing fields of Red Hollow, he knew that tonight wasn't survival. It was debt collection, and he wasn't just a witness. He was a participant, maybe even a chosen sacrifice. And when the Jeep finally skidded to a halt at the base of an abandoned ranger outpost, its windows cracked and rust eating its frame, Ethan stumbled out, chest heaving, the night pressing against him like a living weight, and he saw something carved into the wooden door, fresh, dripping, made with a claw or knife. His name, Ethan. Beneath it, a crude drawing of a face with no eyes, no tongue, just a gaping wound where screams escape, and behind him, the desert exhaled a long, rattling breath, and something whispered in a voice softer than the wind, "Welcome home." The first disappearance was dismissed as nothing. A wanderer, they said, a drunk passing through. But the villagers knew outsiders didn't choose to walk into the dunes at night, and no one ever went near the old ruins willingly. The missing man's name was Sammy, a 19-year-old shepherd who often slept in the fields with his goats. His body wasn't found, but his sandals were. They lay half buried in the sand, the straps torn, as if someone had dragged him away. The goats remained, trembling in a tight cluster, staring at the desert. They wouldn't eat for 2 days. A search was organized, but the winds had already erased every trace. In Daria Kale, the desert was like a mouth. It swallowed anything it wanted. Still, no one panicked. Not yet. The second disappearance broke them. A 6-year-old girl named Azra vanished from her bed. The door was open, no signs of struggle, except for her blanket, which had been dragged to the edge of the threshold, like she'd fought silently before being snatched. Her mother claimed she heard whispering, multiple voices, soft and rhythmic, but no footsteps. And when she ran outside yelling her daughter's name, she said she heard someone answer, "SHHHH. She's ours now." Just a breath of sound. Not human. Not far. That night, people sat awake with weapons, but fear had already changed them. They spoke less, moved less, listened more than they breathed. By the third disappearance, there was an investigation. Not just villagers with torches. Police from a nearby town came. 3 men with rifles, 1 officer trained in search and rescue. They tried to examine the old ruins, but something about the place made their stomach twist. The wind moved strangely there, spiraling, then stopping dead. Even the flies avoided the walls. One officer, young, confident, with a cigarette stuck to his lips, laughed at the villagers' fear. "Ghosts don't kidnap people," he said. "Men do." He stood in the center of the ruins and lit his cigarette. But the match didn't stay lit. Every time he tried, the wind snuffed it instantly. Finally, frustrated, he spat on the ground and kicked one of the stones. That night, he never returned to camp. His 2 colleagues searched until dawn, firing shots into the dark, calling his name until their voices cracked. They found nothing, just his cigarette pack and his boots sitting side by side, perfectly placed on the sand, facing the ruins. Something was patterning them, arranging them, almost ritualistically. By sunrise, the police were gone. They didn't file reports. They didn't interview anyone. They left with shaking hands and avoided eye contact the whole ride back. The villagers understood. They were alone now. A new rule after the officer's disappearance, the village chief enforced a rule that felt almost childish. No one speaks of names after dark. He believed the desert listened, and that calling someone who was missing gave those voices permission to take another. People laughed at first, but the laughter faded by the next disappearance. This time, they didn't lose a villager. They lost 4 travelers at once. A group of young men in a jeep, urban boys with selfie sticks, filming content for their adventure vlog. They stopped in the village for water, joked about ghost towns, and drove toward the dunes at dusk, daring each other to explore the ruins. At 2:17 a.m., the villagers saw their headlights blazing through the desert at inhuman speed, far too fast for the terrain. Then the jeep flipped, rolled twice, and came to a stop. The villagers ran out with lanterns, but when they reached the crash, the jeep was empty. No blood, no footprints, no bodies. The airbags hadn't even gone off. But on the shattered windshield, someone had written a word in dust, "Stay," and next to it, like an afterthought, a childish smiley face drawn with a finger. No one slept after that. Whispers in the static. The village had one radio tower, old and unreliable, mostly broadcasting weather reports that lagged by a day or two. During the nights of the disappearances, the radio turned itself on, nobody knew how, and emitted static that sounded like distant whispering. Children said they could recognize the voices. One old shepherd claimed he heard Sammy saying, "Don't come here, it hurts." Another said he heard the police officer screaming, then begging. But the most chilling broadcast came the night after the Jeep crash. A woman's voice, calm, gentle, almost sweet, whispered, "We are waking. We are hungry. Send more." The radio then burst into laughter. Not human laughter, but layered, mismatched, hundreds of voices overlapping. The chief smashed the radio with an axe. It still hummed for 2 days. The investigator, a month later, a man arrived from the city. He wasn't a policeman. He wasn't a journalist. He said he was investigating a pattern of disappearances across the region. He showed photos, hikers, truck drivers, families on picnics, people who vanished without trace near other abandoned settlements. All gone. All during winter nights. All near ruins like these. The villagers didn't want to talk. Not because they refused, but because they no longer trusted their own voices. He stayed in the house nearest the desert. Every night he sat outside with a notepad, a camera, and a tape recorder, trying to capture proof of whatever prowled beyond the dunes. The villagers begged him to leave before moonrise. He refused. "Monsters don't scare me," he said. "Lies do." His first night, nothing happened. Second night, silence. Third night, the sand moved. It wasn't wind. It wasn't footsteps. It flowed, like something beneath it was crawling, thousands of limbs pushing at the surface but never breaking through. He recorded everything, whispering into the microphone, "There's movement under the ground, it's surrounding me." Suddenly, all motion stopped. Not gradually, abruptly, like someone pressed pause on the desert. Then a voice, very close to the microphone, whispered, "Behind you." The recorder captured the sound of his breath freezing in his chest. A soft gasp. A jerk of movement. Then nothing. They found the microphone still recording, buried in sand. They never found him. The morning after the investigator vanished, the villagers pretended nothing had happened, but their eyes were hollow and restless, and everyone walked faster, spoke softer, and avoided the places where shadows gathered and didn't move with the light. The chief burned incense in the streets, muttering prayers older than the village itself, but the smoke barely rose before collapsing on the ground, as if the desert air was too heavy to lift anything sacred. Nobody mentioned the investigator's name, but some swore they could still see a faint imprint of his body on the sand where he had been sitting, as though the ground itself had pressed down around him and then swallowed him whole. That was when more people began packing to leave, convinced that the desert would not let them live through another month. Whole families loaded whatever they could onto carts, tied ropes around old suitcases, argued about who would carry water and who would carry children, but even their wheels refused to move easily over the dirt, like something invisible was holding them in place. At night, they heard footsteps outside their doors, heavy, slow, dragging, like someone walking with broken knees, and sometimes those footsteps stopped at a window or a doorway and simply waited. People didn't sleep. They didn't speak names. They didn't make plans. They listened. One night, a man woke screaming that someone was standing over his bed, breathing into his ear. His wife lit a lantern, but the flame only flickered weakly, showing nothing but blackness in the corner where she swore there should be wall. Another family reported that they heard children laughing outside at midnight, several voices, playful, innocent, but when they opened their door, the sound cut instantly, and they saw small footprints in the dust that didn't lead anywhere, as if the children had appeared in one spot, laughed, and then vanished into air. Soon, every person in Daria Kale believed they were being watched, not by ghosts but by something patient, intelligent, and hungry. Animals sensed it too. Dogs stopped barking and refused to leave their owners' sides, and goats gathered in tight circles, heads down, shaking without cold. One night, every chicken in the village died at exactly the same hour, their bodies stiff and eyes open, staring upward, as if they died seeing something descending toward them. The chief called a meeting, but it wasn't a gathering, it was a funeral, because nobody believed they had more chances left. He said the land hadn't always been cursed. He said something ancient had been buried beneath the ruins, something that wasn't meant to wake. He said the wind used to blow hard, the sand used to shift freely, but now the desert felt like skin stretched over muscle, and something beneath it was flexing and learning. People asked what it wanted. He didn't know, but he said hunger wasn't always about flesh. Sometimes it was about company, patterns, repetition, filling an emptiness older than humans. Nobody understood him, but nobody argued. The desert didn't take one person at a time anymore. It took groups, clusters, anyone who stayed outside too long or whispered a name loud enough for it to hear. And the voices in the radio weren't echoes. They were invitations, lures, wearing familiar tones so that the living would walk willingly toward their own disappearance. The villagers who tried to leave were met with sandstorms that blocked every road, storms that came from nowhere and ended the moment they returned home. The desert wasn't letting them escape. A woman collapsed in the street crying that she heard her daughter calling from underground, saying she was cold and lonely. Men dug through dunes until their fingers bled, but the sand only refilled itself, smooth and untouched, erasing every hole faster than they could dig. At night, figures stood on the hills, silhouettes tall and thin, motionless, watching the village from a distance. Some villagers thought they were ghosts of the missing. Others said they were shadows of whatever had taken them. Nobody approached. Nobody dared. But every night they came closer, one hill nearer, a few feet at a time, until people began counting them, praying that the number wouldn't grow. The radio tower, though smashed, began broadcasting again, but without static. Just a heartbeat, slow and deep, pulsing through every speaker. Some villagers said it was human. Others swore it sounded like something enormous, buried under miles of sand, waking after centuries of sleep. One night, the heartbeat stopped and a whisper replaced it. Not angry, not cruel, almost affectionate. It said, "You kept us waiting." The chief fell to his knees when he heard it, whispering that the desert wasn't cursed, it was calling home what belonged to it, and that the missing people weren't dead, just taken, transformed into something that walked without flesh and spoke without lungs. People begged him to stop talking, afraid the desert would hear, but he said it already did. The night before the first winter storm, every lantern in the village went out at the same instant. The darkness was absolute, so heavy it felt solid, and children began crying because they felt hands touching their faces, fingers brushing their hair, breath on their skin. Doors creaked open by themselves, windows slammed shut without wind, and footsteps ran down streets faster than any human could run. Someone shouted that the silhouettes were inside the village now, standing at doorways, waiting for lights to return. When the storm finally arrived, lightning flashed for less than a second, and in that flicker of light, everyone saw dozens of tall, thin figures standing in the streets, their limbs too long, heads tilted, watching with hunger not for food but for more voices, more minds, more names to erase. When the lights died again, people didn't scream. They just listened to the sound of footsteps entering homes one by one. They brought back what was left of Derek in a black body bag, zipped so tightly that even the paramedics avoided looking at it, and when the sheriff asked them what they saw, none of them could explain why Derek's bones looked like they had been rearranged, reshaped, bent into angles not meant for humans, as if someone tried to fold him into something else. And that night the surviving rangers gathered inside the old ranger station: Eli, Harper, Valdez, Carl, and newcomer Freya, each of them shaken, sleepless, and trying not to admit what they truly feared: that whatever killed Derek wasn't an animal, wasn't a human, wasn't even something that obeyed the logic of flesh and bone. And Eli stared at the map of the forest where red markers tracked the disappearances over the last 10 years, realizing with cold terror that the killings weren't random. They formed a circle, a ring around the hollow valley where people whispered about a place the Navajo avoided, a place where the skin of a thing was worn like clothes, and voices were stolen like trophies. And Harper admitted quietly that her grandmother once told her there are creatures that don't hunt for hunger, but for imitation, to collect parts of humanity so they can wear them, walk among us, and speak in our voices. And Freya, whose brother vanished in those same woods 6 years earlier, said she once heard him calling her name long after he disappeared. Same voice, same laugh, but the cadence was wrong, too slow, too deliberate, like a machine trying to copy emotion. And before anyone could reply, the radios crackled with a voice that sounded exactly like Derek calling for help, screaming, begging, gasping, "It's still here! It's still here! Let me inside! Please, please, please!" And Carl threw himself toward the radio, screaming Derek's name, but Harper grabbed him, shaking him violently, yelling that Derek was dead. They zipped him up in a bag. They saw his spine twisted backward. They saw his eyes gouged out. They saw his jaw bent into a smile it couldn't form, and she hissed in terror that whatever was speaking through the radio wasn't Derek, and suddenly every light in the station died. The generator shut down, the heater cut, and the wind outside began mimicking human voices, childlike, laughing, crying, whispering the names of the rangers one by one, as if the forest itself remembered every person it ever consumed. And Freya, shaking uncontrollably, confessed that she found something years ago in a cave, a marking, a symbol, something human but not human, and she believed that her brother had been taken not to be eaten, but to be transformed, broken, carved, rebuilt, until he no longer remembered he was human. And the only way to stop it, the only way to end the curse, was to enter the valley at night and kill the heart of what lived there, not physically, but spiritually, by burning its collection of stolen voices, because as long as the creature wore human memories, it could imitate anything, anyone, and survive forever. And though every one of them swore they would never set foot in that valley, 3 hours later they were armed. Armed not with guns but with torches and symbols carved in white ash, following Freya into a forest that no longer felt like a place of nature, but a mouth waiting to swallow them. And the deeper they walked, the more the night changed, bending around them, growing warmer, smelling like rot, sounding like footsteps behind them. Footsteps too close, too human, too familiar. And at the entrance to the valley they saw figures standing motionless in the tree line. Half-broken silhouettes that looked like lost hikers, lost children, missing rangers, all of them watching silently, heads twitching, limbs hanging wrong. And Eli whispered that he recognized one of them, his friend Liam, who vanished 2 years ago. But before he could call out, a voice whispered from behind them, one that sounded exactly like Derek, cold and playful, "You shouldn't have come back." The storm had finally broken over the valley when we descended into the skeletal forest, drenched and shivering, chasing the faint and agonizing cries that sounded like our missing friends even though we knew they were gone. And the radio was nothing more than a cracked piece of equipment picking up whatever ghosts lived between the frequencies. But still we ran, stupidly, through the mud and black branches, driven by some desperate human instinct to save what we thought was left, only to find ourselves surrounded by stone stacks like graves without names, each one topped with a skull that wasn't quite human, jaws broken too wide, eyes carved into spirals like native marks corrupted, and as lightning forked above us, we saw silhouettes crouched on top of the rocks, shapes tall and thin, skin stretched and wet, bones poking through like they were built inside out, and they watched us with those hollow green eyes that seemed to flicker with hunger and mockery. And we realized with a crushing sense of dread that this was not a battlefield, not a campsite, but a feeding ground, a ritual pit, and we were stepping into the climax of something that had been waiting centuries to wake, because the Skinwalkers didn't hunt one by one like animals, but gathered like priests around a sacrifice, and when they dropped from the stone stacks, the sound wasn't a growl, but a scream of wind ripping through flesh, and the first one tackled Miguel so violently his ribs popped like branches, dragging him away into the dark before he could breathe a single word, while Sarah fired burst after burst into the shapes gliding closer, bullets hitting bone and tearing skin but doing nothing except anger them, because bullets are useless when the body wearing human skin is only a disguise, and when one of them spoke in Miguel's voice, begging us to help in that shaky, terrified tone he had always used, and reached towards Sarah with trembling hands like a dying man, she hesitated just long enough for the thing's jaw to split open vertically like a blooming flower of teeth, latching onto her head and ripping it cleanly from her neck so she collapsed into the mud headless, twitching, and I screamed so hard my throat shredded, and for the first time I understood why legends warned never to speak their names, because they mimic voices, mimic pleas, mimic the dying, to break the human instinct to run, but something in me snapped, not bravery, not heroism, but a hopeless animal rage, and I fired into the creature chewing Sarah's face, blasting chunks of skull off until its body collapsed like collapsing fabric, showing that the only way to kill a Skinwalker was not to wound it, but to destroy the disguise entirely. And then the earth beneath our feet began to hum, a rhythmic pulse, and the stone stacks lit with a dull red glow as though embers burned inside, and the remaining Skinwalkers turned toward them, jerking erratically like puppets pulled by invisible strings, and the valley filled with a low chant made of 1,000 voices not from this world, and all their heads turned toward me in the same instant, necks twisting too far like uncooked chicken bones, and a voice that was not theirs but something ancient said through them all, "You came in answer to the call," and I realized the disappearances weren't random. People weren't hunted for food. People were taken because the Skinwalkers had been gathering flesh, gathering voices, gathering bodies, preparing for a resurrection, an opening, a tearing of the barrier between what we call reality and whatever rotting dimension they came from. And the storm overhead wasn't weather, it was pressure from things pushing through, and I ran, blind, through rain and shadows, hearing Miguel's voice calling my name behind me, not begging, not afraid, but laughing, and when I reached the abandoned ranger station, lightning hit a nearby tree and set it ablaze, illuminating the thing that stood at the door, wearing a ranger uniform stretched over bones like someone had pinned a shirt to a scarecrow, and it tilted its head and said my name perfectly, and then said, "I remember your skin," and I raised my rifle with shaking arms as footsteps approached from all sides, wet feet slapping the mud, claws scraping the wood, and I understood there was no rescue, no cavalry, no sunrise salvation in this kind of nightmare. So I set the whole station on fire, tossing gas and lighting it with a flare, watching the flames swallow the building and everything inside, including the bodies that had been strung up like meat, including the creatures screaming in borrowed voices, and I ran again, stumbling out of the valley and collapsing onto the main road with my lungs burning and my mind splitting, until headlights blinded me and a truck braked inches from my face and voices shouted if I was okay, but when I tried to speak, nothing came out except Miguel's voice, perfectly mimicked, begging for help in a tone I didn't choose, and I realized with a horror greater than anything I had seen in that valley that Skinwalkers don't just wear the bodies they kill, they wear the survivors too, and something had followed me out, something had followed me into my voice, and when I looked in the truck mirror, for a second too fast to prove, I saw green eyes staring back that were not mine, something smiling just under the skin, and the last thing I heard before I passed out wasn't the humans asking what happened, but a faint whisper inside my head saying, "The call has been answered, the gate is open," and I woke in a hospital days later with bandages over my throat and a detective asking questions, and I lied with a voice that wasn't mine, because if I told the truth, they would go back there, and the Skinwalkers don't want to be stopped, they want to spread, and they are already wearing the voices of the lost.